So I'll jump into introductions about the center and this group specifically, the interdisciplinary religion group. Feel free to keep putting stuff in the chat, and maybe more interesting for you to find to see who else is in the room here. But in any case, we are the Center for Religion and Global Citizenry. This is one of our main programs here, the Interdisciplinary Religion Group. We as a group are kind of an informal working group of mostly graduate students and faculty members, also some community members, and today some more undergraduates as well, who have serious interests in religion and the academic study of religion. So our desire is to provide a forum where participants can workshop their research in progress, discuss theoretical and practical issues involved in the academic study of religion, and also to form connections across departments and across our community in Madison here. Yeah, we're aiming to hold monthly meetings this semester. We're holding 3 meetings. This is our second of 3. We'll be meeting again in December. Killian will actually be offering our talk that day about pilgrimage in 19th century France, if I have that correct. Killian, you can give me a nod.
18th century, yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Good to see you today here, Killian. Another big thing that we do at the CRGC is an undergraduate fellowship. We bring undergraduates across, a variety of religious and secular backgrounds together to have dialogue, put on events on campus. Really develop kind of religious literacy, interfaith, interreligious literacy, so that they can better have dialogue across difference and function effectively as citizens in an increasingly pluralistic world. So we have a couple of former fellows and current fellows with us today. So glad to have you here as well. I think that's enough for formal backgrounds about our center. I give it up to Ulrich, the director of our center, to introduce our speaker for today.
Yeah, great. Thanks, David. Hi, Vaneesa. Happy to introduce Vaneesa Cook, UW History PhD 2015, who will talk to us about her book, Spiritual Socialists, Religion and the American Left. In her book, Vaneesa shows that prayer and activism go a long way in America. There's a long history of people of deep faith who drew on ideas of socialism. There is an intense cross-fertilization of religious values and socialist political ideas. In America, the spiritual and the political, prayer and activism intersect. This core argument of Vaneesa's book reminded me of I don't know how famous, but a quote by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Some of you might recognize it right away. After the civil rights campaign in Selma, Alabama in February and March 1965, Heschel said, quote, "For many of us, the march from Selma to Montgomery was about protest and prayer. Legs are not lips, and walking is not kneeling. And yet, our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying. I felt my legs were praying." I'm excited to hear from Vaneesa. That Heschel's statement is a symbol of a much longer story. A story that, I hope, is still an ongoing one. So, and with that, please welcome with me Vaneesa Cook for her talk on Spiritual Socialists, Religion and the American Left.
Thank you, Ulrich. Can everyone hear me okay, or can somebody not hear me okay? I guess it's the better question. All right, thank you very much. I'm going to go to screen share mode if I can here. I have a nifty PowerPoint that you're hopefully seeing now. Alrighty. Okay. So thank you very much. My book came out last fall around this time or a little after with University of Pennsylvania Press. So it is available there. It's also available via Amazon. But many of my book talks that I had lined up in the winter and spring, of course, got canceled after COVID hit and the shutdown happened. So I'm very happy that that you guys invited me here to give really my first book talk. I've talked about it a little bit here and there, but this is the first time I'm using this slide deck and talking about it in a very formal way like this. So I appreciate that. And so I came up with this term, spiritual socialist. I started to see evidence of a tradition, an overlooked tradition in American history of what I came to call spiritual socialism. That really gives a different perspective on progressive activism that, you know, does oftentimes have a religious component to it, and also challenges the idea that religion and religious values is really just associated with conservative movements, and Republican Party are antithetical to, you know, progressive activism, leftist agendas, or that sort of a political, on that side of the political spectrum. So I do go into, I think that the introduction of the book was circulated. I don't know how many people had a chance to read that, but I go into the concept and the tradition there and a little bit of the historiography in that introduction, but I really tell the story mostly through a number of different figures, and it's, you know, different maybe case studies or semi-biographical or mini biographies of these different activists who gravitated towards this different type of socialism that I'll identify and talk more about here in a second. One of those individuals that I feature prominently in the book is Sherwood Eddy. You may know he was a fairly widely known figure, a religious voice, a religious leader in America. He was associated primarily with the YMCA, and particularly the missionary arm of the YMCA, so the student volunteer movement. And he became a traveling secretary for the YMCA in Asia. He spent a lot of time in China, a lot of time in India in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, trying to, you know, promote Christianity in those places, and not only make conversions, but as he went on, starting to actually be more concerned with the material needs of people in those areas as well. But in any case, sorry, I don't know if there's a way to, there we go. In any case, Sherwood Eddy, in 1931, he comes back to the United States. He had not only served abroad for many decades, but he was also a chaplain. He served as a chaplain during World War I in France. And that really changed his viewpoint about capitalism, where he started to see capitalism as a culprit in violence and war and suffering around the world. But he comes back to the United States in 1931. He's at a YMCA ceremony honoring him and you know, talking about all of his decades of service. And he comes out and very boldly states, "I am not a communist, I am not a capitalist, I am a socialist." And this was a fairly controversial statement for him to make in the early 30s, even though there was increasing radical activity in the context of the Great Depression. He knew it was a bold statement to make. I don't think many people were surprised, because he had been writing and talking about you know, socialist concepts for many years. But for him to, you know, just come out with this in a very unapologetic way, and to identify with this term so closely was controversial. And he was aware of this. He gets immediate backlash. You have to imagine that this ceremony was attended by many of the leadership in the YMCA, a lot of major donors of the YMCA, who, and many of them were outraged by this statement and said, you know, called for his resignation. And you know, how could we have someone in a leadership position going around to universities and colleges and infecting the minds of youth with these kind of ideas? He did offer to resign from the organization in the aftermath, But his colleagues said, no, 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 you know, that's not necessary. This will blow over. We're still with you. But I wanted to start out by addressing that controversy. You know, why was the term socialist, and still continues to be, socialist is a weighted term with a lot of negative connotations, with a lot of baggage with it, and that has always been the case. And so, you know, what did Eddy mean by this? Was it the term and the concept that people usually associate with it? And the answer there is not really. So we'll get into that here. So what is socialism? Socialism has many different versions. Emerging from the early 1800s, people talking about cooperative communities even back then, particularly in Europe. And so it's not just Marxist, not just, you know, the orthodox or traditional version that was popularized by Karl Marx and Engels. But in all of its different varieties, it does promote economic equality. And it is a response usually to the exploitative conditions of industrial capitalism, which happened first in Europe and then in the United States, and you know, a few decades later in the late 1800s. Karl Marx, of course, made it most popular, and so it's mostly associated with him even to this day, for better or worse. But in pamphlets and writings like the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx did talk about his version of socialism. But in his version of socialism, and some of you in the audience may be more expertly versed in Marxist theory than I am, but just basically, socialism in his view was an intermediate stage or a temporary stage in the evolution of human society, human economic structures. And in his version of socialism, yes, it was going to be very state-centered. The state was going to manage the economy, manage society to make it more equitable, to make it more fair. There was going to be some coercion involved. But his hope was that eventually, as human beings became, you know, started to behave in a more equitable way, learn these behaviors, that eventually society would evolve to the point where that state apparatus would disappear. It would no longer be needed. People would just treat each other well. That equality, peace, cooperation would just be a matter of fact. It would be normative and not something that needed to be coerced by a large state apparatus. And that was his utopian vision that he called communism. So communism was the end game there, and it was this very utopian sort of perfect society that he hoped for at the end of history. But a lot of people, instead of, you know, looking at the whole big picture that he painted there, critics really focused on the negative aspects of his theory. They focused on the state authority, you know, maybe the threats to freedom and liberty that were implied there. They focused on you know, the possibility of a violent revolution, overturning capitalism because it was no longer sufficient, or the problems of capitalism had become too onerous. And so this became, even though his work was very popular and it came out of the revolutions of the mid-1800s in Europe and, you know, the exploitative conditions of industrial capitalism in Europe, in the late 1800s, when America starts to industrialize and become and confront these problems, Marx starts to gain traction in the United States, and there are many critics focusing on these negative aspects. And they think of it as a dangerous ideology that could cause problems, social upheaval in the United States, more so than people wanted. And so, you know, here's a poster from either the late 1800s or early 1900s, the International Workers of the World, or the IWW, also known as the Wobblies. You know, this poster, for many workers who were frustrated with the conditions that they were living in big cities like Chicago or New York City, this might be a comfort to them, or it might be inspiring to them to be part of this union and to come together and cooperate for more equitable conditions. But it was also, you know, you could see how this poster could be very threatening to people and could amplify these more negative aspects of, you know, this dangerous foreign influence is coming to infect the minds of American workers and perhaps cause all this social upheaval and violence and overthrow everything that we know in our daily life. Joseph Stalin, he becomes the poster boy for these negative connotations, and in some ways I think Joseph Stalin did more to discredit socialism than anyone else in history. So critics who were already finding fault with Marxism and socialism could point to Stalin as an example of, here's this, of course, that this is the authoritarian government that we're talking about. Here's the dictator that, of course, socialism or communism will inevitably lead to. And as the crimes of Stalin, as a dictator, as a brutal, suppressor of human rights and liberties and political expression, as that becomes more public knowledge, people do start to criticize socialism and communism more vehemently. Not only people who had never really sided with socialist principles, but even fellow travelers or former communists and socialists themselves became disillusioned in the 40s and 50s, and not only denounced Stalin and the Soviet Union, but started to question their belief in socialism altogether. And so there was this time of questioning and disillusionment in the 40s and 50s, where the left was in disarray and didn't really know, what to believe in anymore after the crimes of Stalin became more public knowledge. But there were always movements in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. There were always movements in America that were promoting the more positive aspects of socialism and trying to show that it wasn't just this one form. It wasn't just Marxist theory. It wasn't just the Soviet Union. It wasn't just these traditional definitions that people thought of, but that there were different varieties: democratic socialism or social democracy, Christian socialism. So there were many people who considered themselves Christian socialists and used that term. And then spiritual socialism, which is the term I came up with and use, and I'm attaching that to the figures in this book. That it's very much like Christian socialism and the social gospel, except that I would say it's more inclusive of different religions, not just Christianity. But spiritual socialists, while they were primarily Christian, they did not think that their form of socialism or their worldview was just narrowly confined to Christians, or that Christianity was the only religion that could carry this vision forward. They found common cause with Jews who shared their values, Buddhists who shared their values, Hindus like Gandhi who shared their values. Gandhi was a huge inspiration to them. Didn't talk as much about Islam and Muslims, but that may have just been the circumstances of the time period. But certainly Islam, any Muslim who shared their values and their goals, they would also find common cause with. So it's more about the values of promoting equality, peace, loving one another, taking care of your neighbors, taking care of each other in the way that Jesus said to in the Gospels, putting other people's welfare before your own welfare, before your own pocketbook, caring more about people rather than money. Those kind of values, looking to a perfected society, which they called the kingdom of God on earth. So instead of Marx's communist utopia, instead of that end period where everyone just cooperated and got along and it was peaceful, they always called that the kingdom of God on earth, the coming kingdom of God on earth, that human beings were complicit in creating, that they could help God by following values and implementing them in society. They could help get human society to that point. So here's just a breakdown of that traditional definition I just went over, and then spiritual socialism as an alternative to that. So instead of just state-centered, strong central government, spiritual socialists thought more about decentralized local activism, working in your communities, not just legislating things from above, not just hoping that the government would solve all of the problems on a national scale, but actually implementing your values with your neighbors in your community, getting involved to help each other at that most basic level. Traditional socialism focused mostly on the proletariat, people as workers, primarily people as workers and their problems as workers, labor issues such as wages, benefits, working conditions. Instead, spiritual socialists really expanded the agenda of the left and progressive action to include issues of class, not just class, but race and gender issues. Especially as we get more into the 50s and 60s, those issues you can see becoming more prominent on leftist activist agendas. So not just the material needs of individuals, such as, classic Marxist emphasis on materialism, but also concern with the spiritual needs of individuals, that more holistic approach to individual happiness and welfare. And then in traditional socialism, violent revolution could be considered as a means to get to that next level of socialism and eventually communism. But spiritual socialists preferred peaceful social change, a more gradual, slower change where socialism was built from the bottom up, from the local up to, the state and national levels, that it wasn't just an immediate revolution. They thought that the same problems would just occur in the next regime until people learned how to behave differently, to behave in a more Christian way, to implement their Christian values in their daily life. So it was that idea of implementing values in daily life that really drove them and marked a major difference between them and a lot of traditional socialists. So to get back to Sherwood Eddy, who I started with here, that's more what he meant when he said, "I'm a socialist." And he knew it was a fraught term. He knew it might be misconstrued. And I want to just acknowledge that in the book, I referred to a lot of figures who I identify with this tradition. That doesn't mean that they were as outspoken about embracing this term as Eddy was. Eddy was an exception to come right out and say, "Hey, I'm a socialist, deal with it." He wasn't as concerned with people misunderstanding that. He maybe wanted people to misunderstand it, to make them think differently, and for him to make Christians think, "Oh, here's this prominent Christian who's calling himself a socialist. How are those things compatible?" So I think that was his intent there. But many of the other figures in this book were a little more wary of coming out and identifying with that term because they knew that people would think of it in a certain way. They may not be familiar with the way that they were talking or thinking about socialism, and they didn't want to have to explain themselves or to, suffer the criticism that would follow from using that term. So it is a controversial term for all of the people in this book. I'm going to talk a little bit about Sherwood Eddy. He grew up in Kansas in a very prominent, rather wealthy family in Kansas. His father was a businessman in his town, left him with a sizable inheritance after his father died. So much so that Eddy was independently wealthy all his life. And he states that this is what made him more able to devote his life to missions work and to promoting Christianity throughout his life. But he goes to college at Princeton, intending to be an engineer or a businessman and to build on his family wealth. But an event intervenes in his life and changes the course of his life. While he's in college, he goes to a Dwight Moody Institute. A Dwight Moody was a preacher, itinerant preacher who would hold these sort of rallies or retreats for college students. And Eddy goes up to upstate New York in the late 1800s, and he is changed forever. He's so inspired by Dwight Moody and his call to devote some years of your life to foreign missions that he signs off and agrees that after he graduates college, he's going to do that. So he follows through on that, and he starts to serve as a missionary in India and China, and he continues to do this for decades. While he's in India and China, he does experiment with different forms of community building, different forms of trying to get Christian conversions. He originally starts with a more top-down sort of quantity over quality sort of approach, but realizes over time that he should really trust locals to be community leaders and build more from the grassroots rather than just trying to make artificial conversions that might not stick. And he also starts to realize that it's not just conversions to Christianity that he should be concerned with, but he sees the poverty, he sees the government exploitation of people, and he starts to also consider that as something that should be on his mind and should be part of his Christian mission. As I mentioned earlier, he becomes a chaplain in France during World War I, and he becomes much more outspoken against capitalism. He becomes convinced that capitalism has created such a structural, such a structure that people are more driven towards greed, more driven towards money accumulation, wealth, and therefore violence, and that these capitalist values are incompatible with his Christian values, And so he does start to write and talk more in a more critical way about capitalism, and this accelerates his path towards socialism. After the war, he starts a traveling seminar. It's called the American Seminar, and he takes a group of many clergy, but also laymen and women, on a month tour around Europe, mostly Europe. Every year he takes a group in the 1920s to England, Germany, sometimes Russia, sometimes the Soviet Union, to learn about what these social democracies or these, so-called socialist countries are doing. In my book. Dorothy Day, when she goes to New York City, she becomes involved in radical leftist circles. Some would call her a fellow traveler. She writes articles. She's a journalist for some radical periodicals. And her circle of friends is really communists, socialists of that variety, who don't really put a lot of stock in religious values or church or religious institutions. And for a while, she's convinced of that. She goes along with that idea that religion really has nothing to do with radical activism and changing society. But when she becomes pregnant with her daughter, something changes within her. She all of a sudden wants her daughter to have a religious upbringing. She takes her daughter to church, or has her daughter baptized, and then discovers this spiritual longing within herself, and decides that she also wants to be baptized and become more integrated into a Christian church and community. So she becomes a very devout Catholic. This is a big deal. It causes a break with her family and friends, many of whom can't understand this complete turnaround in her lifestyle. They can't understand how someone who was so devoted to radical activism could embrace Catholicism, what they saw as an oppressive institution. But she feels so strongly about it, and she does go through a period of years where she's not sure how to reconcile her belief in progressive activism and social justice with her new Catholic identity. And this is troubling for her for a few years, but in the early 1930s, she does start to realize that they are compatible, and that she doesn't need to stop her belief in social justice or her activism for social justice just because she's a Catholic, or just because she's critical of the Catholic Church in some ways. And so that inspires her to co-found Catholic Worker with Peter Morin, who is an itinerant religious activist. They become co-founders of Catholic Worker in New York City, and they open the first hospitality house for people who need a place to stay, people who need a meal, people who are slipping through the cracks of the government system and the New Deal in the 1930s. And so they print a newspaper, and they start this settlement house, and it sparks this movement in the 1930s. And she realizes that she's really competing with folks that she used to associate with, the more atheistic radicals that she used to be part of that circle. And she used to think that, she says in her memoir, she's written a few memoirs, Loaves and Fishes, The Long Loneliness, from Union Square to Rome are three of her memoirs that you can read. But she says she used to think that communists and socialists were the only ones trying to reform the world and to take care of people, and that church people were too conservative and too concerned about money and the society as the way it was, the status quo. But when she opens Catholic Worker, she realizes that, you know, she is offering an alternative to that has a religious component, that has more religious substance. And here's a quote from one of her memoirs. She says, "Is it to be left to the communists to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless?" Of course, these are references to the Gospels and Matthew 25. She says, "These are the corporal works of mercy that are too often being done by the opposition." And by the opposition, she means radical atheists, socialists and communists. And to what purpose? And so she's hoping that Catholic Worker can start to convince people that religious values are not antithetical to that kind of activism. Now, I mentioned that many of these spiritual socialists weren't quite comfortable with coming out and just embracing the term socialism wholeheartedly. And she struggles with this as well. And there are, if I get a little bit criticism about Dorothy Day and my interpretation of her, many people who have read Dorothy Day say, well, she identified as an anarchist. She had trouble with that term too, because she knew the connotation of anarchism was associated with violence, and Dorothy Day was an absolute pacifist. And so she in no way wanted anyone to think that she advocated violence or destruction or upheaval. And so at some point in her diary, she says, "I prefer Martin Buber's term, utopian socialist." And so this is the evidence, having combed through all of her diaries and correspondence, which are also published in bound volumes, this is the evidence I can point to that she may have used a few different identification terms, but she says, "I prefer utopian socialists." And so I think this shows that she was open to the concept that I've outlined, where we can build these grassroots movements of Christian community that will eventually lead to this utopian vision of a kingdom of God on earth. We know that Dorothy Day was reading Bread and Wine in the 1930s. She records it in her diary and is, loves the book and sees a lot of similarities with her own trajectory with radical activism and that of Ignazio Silone. For those of you who don't know, Silone was part of the Communist Party in Italy and was working his way up the ranks of the Communist Party. He's one of those people who become disillusioned with the Soviet Union and Stalin in the 1930s and has a bit of a breakdown for a number of years where his identity, it just shatters his identity and his belief in the new world and the possibilities of making a new world. But he eventually comes to terms with going back to what the roots of socialism are for him. What does it break down to? If you deconstruct socialism, what is it about? And he starts to write these novels like Bread and Wine about what are the basic values of socialism. And he says it's really just taking care of people. It's, caring more about your neighbor than yourself. It's following Jesus's mandate to to feed the hungry, visit the people in prison, to take care of the sick. And so he says, "I do not conceive of socialist policy as tied to any particular theory, but to a faith, that it's really community activism and caring for people around you with those Christian values that really makes socialism what it is." And another quote here, "The union of the poor assumes an eschatological force." Again, working towards that kingdom of God on earth as this endpoint that, progressive activism can look toward. So Catholic Worker House is an example of this, of building up, a community of, the poor and the disenfranchised, the least of these in your own community. And so that's what Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin started to do in their neighborhood in Lower Manhattan. And then going back to Sherwood Eddy again, the Delta Cooperative farms in the 1930s were his way of trying to implement socialism in a small community. And so during the Great Depression, even though there were programs to help farmers make it through the tough times, many sharecroppers were displaced from the farms that they had been working. They started the Southern Tenant Farmers Union as a way to try and come together and cope with these changes. But there was still an outstanding need to help a lot of mostly African-American sharecroppers, but also white sharecroppers who really had no place to go, and the New Deal didn't really apply to them, or wasn't helping them as much as it did farm owners. And so Sherwood Eddy hears from one of his associates about the circumstances in Mississippi and Arkansas, and Sherwood Eddy goes to this region. He sees the conditions firsthand, and with some of his independent wealth, he decides to invest in this. He buys 2 tracts of land, 2 farms, one in Mississippi and one in Arkansas, I believe. They have different names, but collectively they're known as the Delta Cooperative Farms. And he invites a number of sharecroppers, both black and white, to live and work on this farm in a cooperative community. And he really does consider this a socialist experiment. He talks about it in those terms. He invites local Socialist Party leaders and National Socialist Party leaders to help support it through funding and just, word of mouth. And he does get a lot of support from people like Howard Kester and H.L. Mitchell, who were socialists and think that this is a great opportunity to see this kind of grassroots activism in this socialist experiment, and interracial as well. It does last for a number of years, but it does face a lot of criticism and challenges from locals who take issue with the interracial component of their activity. And so it does eventually shut down because of the pressures of the locale, because there are people working and living together in such intimacy. A.J. Muste also follows a similar trajectory of Dorothy Day and Ignacio Salone in a way. Well, Muste did grow up religious. He was a minister for a while until World War I, when he gave up his pulpit because of his anti-war beliefs. He could not advocate or promote the war on the pulpit, and he faced a lot of, he was discredited by his congregation for those reasons, and he decided he has to follow his Christian values and his Christian heart rather than the crowd. He becomes more involved in labor issues, a labor strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and then becomes involved in a number of different labor organizations, socialist and more of the Trotsky variety. And he believes in revolution for a number of years. He believes in imminent revolution during the Great Depression. But before that, he is involved in Brookwood College, which he was sort of the headmaster of it was in upstate New York. And Brookwood College was a labor college. It was a labor educational institution where they would invite workers from around the world, from around the country, to come to these seminars, or like sort of a retreat, and talk about theory, learn about different forms of socialism, learn about different organizing techniques. And the idea was that they would go back to their trade unions and share these ideas and implement these techniques. And so A.J. Muste was a co-founder of this school. He was the lead teacher and spokesperson for it. It did attract some controversy that I go into in the book, but Muste eventually decides that he doesn't want to just teach. He wants to be really in the fray. He wants to be an activist. And in the midst of the Great Depression, like I said, he's thinking this is our chance. This is our chance to seize the day and overthrow capitalism once and for all. So he does get involved with some radical organizations, and co-found some other radical organizations like the Conference for Progressive Labor Action, which becomes the American Workers' Party. And he puts his religious values aside for a little while, thinking that, it's not that I'm not a Christian anymore, but I'm willing to be involved in violence, or violence might be necessary to get where we want to go. In 1936, however, in a very, it marks a milestone in his life, this essay that he writes called Return to Pacifism, in which he realizes that that's not the way to do it, that violent revolution is never going to turn out the society that he wants, or that people like him want. And he starts to talk about the means and the ends must line up. If you want a peaceful, cooperative society, then you have to use the means of peace and cooperation to get there. And so in 1936, he sort of starts to reinstate his religious values and his religious rhetoric into everything he does. He's still a radical activist. He's still pro-labor. He's still socialist, but he says the necessary saving conclusion is that a moral and religious spirit must be infused into every relation of life that is now drawn. And so he's saying, just like Eddy, just like Day, and he was close to Day. They participated in labor activities, strikes and marches, anti-war marches. Like both of them, he is saying to people, you really need to practice your Christian values in everything you do, including your radical activism. You can't separate it and think, oh, well, we'll get to that later, or it doesn't apply here. He's saying we must go through those means to get to those ends of the kingdom of God on earth. Now, I've talked a lot about what spiritual socialists agree on, different principles and values and goals, but they were divided on some issues. And the biggest one, I think, is violence and war. And I have a whole chapter devoted to this in more detail, but there was a difference of opinion, particularly when we get to World War II, among these spiritual socialists. And some of them thought that, the Allied cause to fight off Hitler and fascism in Europe was completely justified. If you know about just war theory, they took up that argument and said, these are evil forces and we need to fight against them. We need to fight, good with evil. And they saw it as spiritual warfare. They also saw it in terms of these evil forces uprooting everything they had worked toward. If they're working towards the kingdom of God on earth and they see that there's progress being made, in the United States and elsewhere, they're afraid that Hitler and other fascists will wipe that out and you'll have to start off from scratch, or have additional challenges to get there. And so they think about defending the kingdom of God on earth and rationalize war and violence in that way. So Sherwood Eddy fits into that category, even though Sherwood Eddy was part of the Fellowship of Reconciliation for a while and other pacifist organizations. He was never an absolute pacifist. He always sort of held out that possibility of using violence for the better good. Henry A. Wallace, who I'll mention here next, national politician. He was part of the Allied cause. He was in the war room with FDR, and he also saw World War II in these terms as spiritual warfare. And then on the other side were those who stuck to their absolute pacifist beliefs during World War II and then Vietnam. Dorothy Day, A.J. Muste, and Stoughton Lynn, who I'll get to in a second as well. So Henry Wallace, as many of you may know, he was a national politician in the administration of Franklin Roosevelt in the 30s and 40s. First, he was a cabinet member in FDR's agricultural department, and then he became vice president during World War II. And in all of his speeches, and I quote from him extensively in the chapters in this book, but in all of his speeches and writings, he overwhelmingly uses explicit religious language. He does not shy away from it whatsoever. Other prominent politicians, including FDR, of course, sprinkled their speeches with religious references, but it was more of like a civic religious rhetoric. Henry Wallace, if you read his speeches and writings, it is really, I'm not exaggerating when I say he says, the forces of Satan, you know, Hitler and fascists are the forces of Satan, and these satanic movements, and where our cause is with the cause of the Lord. And, you know, everything is in terms of the spiritual warfare, and very explicit religious language about social change and the purpose of the New Deal. That the New Deal is this temporary state apparatus that is leading us toward a better society. The Century of Progress, in his famous essay, The Century of Man, he refers to this as well, but he says, you know, is it possible that the world is finally ready for the realization of the teachings of Jesus, the bringing of the kingdom of heaven on earth? He was very open-minded about religion, mystical religion, different Native American religions, which were got him into trouble sometimes. Critics would publish some of his letters and his private letters to people who that came out as very mystical and maybe strange to a lot of Americans, that he was speaking in these terms, and people started to think, is he really Christian? Is there something wrong with this guy? And some scholars have even gone so far as to say that FDR may have decided to drop him as vice president and eventually go with Truman because of the controversy surrounding his, you know, very mystical religious outlooks, or his very, very bold religious rhetoric, not just rhetoric, but his beliefs in spiritual warfare. But even though Henry Wallace was this national figure and was a New Dealer and implemented these programs from the top down, I include him in this book as a spiritual socialist because he thought of the New Deal as a temporary solution. He said that over and over again. The New Deal is just a stepping stone to a more cooperative society, which he saw happening at the local level from the bottom up. And he talked about the coming kingdom of God in the same way that these other spiritual socialists did. Every minute of the day is a religious experience. So he's also talking about how religious values need to infuse everything we do. There he is with Pete Seeger, who is he's a good segue to my next segment there. Pete Seeger, a prominent radical activist, musician that becomes more prominent in the civil rights movement as well. So the civil rights movement is the next major movement that has these religious components, these heavy religious undercurrents, with many people of faith, many ministers participating in these movements, particularly Southern, the Black church movement, and Southern ministers such as Martin Luther King Jr. and his associates in Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But there are connections, many connections in this network of spiritual socialism. One of them is Myles Horton. Myles Horton there on the right, he was the founder or co-founder of the Highlander Folk School. And if you read his writings, which I excerpt from in the book, as he's growing up and going to different theological schools and absorbing the theories of the Dutch folk schools, he's trying to reconcile his Christian values with his interest in social justice and changing the world from the bottom up. And so Highlander is his approach to that, which he starts in Tennessee and is still going on today. And from the outset, he is dedicated to interracial progressive education and progressive organization. So he brings white Christian activists and Black Christian activists together for seminars, for extended summer retreats, including Rosa Parks, who went through the school at one point. Martin Luther King Jr. is a speaker there. And so this does become one of the nodes of this network of later civil rights activism. And Myles Horton connected to some of the people that I've already mentioned. And so here's an example of race becoming a bigger issue for leftist activists. And I think spiritual socialists do a lot to promote this idea that it's not just about class, it's not just about people as workers, but what other forms of oppression are people facing? And of course, race is something that they identify as an issue, major issue, and a major problem with the Christian society from the very beginning, but it gained more traction in the 50s and 60s. And Myles Horton is a Christian socialist who is involved in that. Highlander Folk School, also subject to criticism, backlash from the community, vandalism, even vandalism recently in the last 3 years. And then the New Left movement, the civil rights movement is part of the New Left movement. But in the late 50s and early 60s, a lot of college age students become involved in the civil rights movement, become radicalized by it, start to participate or go to the South with the Freedom Summer or the Freedom Schools. Stoughton Lynd is one of them. He's not a student, he's actually a professor in the South, but he becomes involved in the Freedom Schools, and he becomes a history teacher for them in the early 1960s. But I profile Stoughton Lynd in the book because Stoughton Lynd, unlike some New Left activists or many New Left activists, Stoughton Lynd always talked in spiritual language or talked about the need to address spiritual components, not just materialism or to, to have a more holistic approach to what leftist activism could mean. Lynd and his wife were Quakers. They were involved in a number of different intentional communities or cooperative communities throughout their life. And they always looked to a very democratic, decentralized form of socialism. So Stoughton Lynd definitely identified as a socialist and tried to push back against the negative connotations of socialism, not just within America at large, but also new leftists he saw kind of dancing around this term and not really wanting to embrace it, particularly with the Cold War and the Red Scare, and all the consequences of calling yourself a socialist that could come from that. So he is a voice in the New Left that talks in spiritual terms. Greg Calvert is another one. He wrote a book later called Democracy of the Heart, in which he talks about the need for spiritual values in any kind of progressive activism. And then the Port Huron Statement, if you compare the Port Huron Statement to earlier manifestos, by leftist organizations, I think it's easy to see that there's a lot more spiritual language in the Port Huron Statement that might come across as a little fluffy and sentimental to, hardcore radicals. But when I talked to Tom Hayden years ago, Tom Hayden, who, as many of you know, was one of the principal authors of the Port Huron Statement, he said that when Students for Democratic Society were meeting to write the Port Huron Statement in Port Huron, Michigan in the early 1960s, they were at this retreat, they were working on this statement, this pamphlet, and they had different committees assigned to different topics like labor or race or university problems. And he said that one of the sections was supposed to be about religion, but the principal author of that section or the head of that committee slept in the morning that they were supposed to all read the sections and make changes to them and then vote on whether, they would be included in the pamphlet. And so he said that is why there's this gap missing from the Port Huron Statement where it doesn't really address religion, but that's not what was supposed to happen. So it was just this fluke thing where, the person responsible for that section slept in and it was never included. And so that gave me a lot of, it made me feel better in a way because I had been looking for that evidence for a long time because I thought it was there implicitly, but it's also lost to us now, which is a shame that we don't have that more explicit language about how SDS would have approached religion and religious values. And that may have made a difference about how the New Left was understood. In this New Left movement, I also, in the book, in this chapter, in the book, I also mentioned Pauli Murray, who many of you may be familiar with, and her trajectory from, she was involved in progressive activism in her life on campuses where she became a professor, but then also an Episcopal priest. And she brings up not only race issues, but also issues of gender as well, even accusing the civil rights movement of having a gender problem. So anyway, she is also included in the book, but for interest of time, I did not include her in this presentation. And then Spiritual Socialists Today, question mark. Here are two of the figures I point to most often. Reverend William Barber, who you may have heard of, he's spoken at the Democratic National Convention before. His movement, Moral Mondays, started in North Carolina as a way to fight against voter suppression in North Carolina and promote racial justice in North Carolina, but he has expanded that to the whole country. And Repairers of the Breach, his organization Repairers of the Breach, there's a branch in Milwaukee. He's been to Wisconsin several times to speak. I saw him in a church in Milwaukee a few years ago. Now I say spiritual socialist question mark because William Barber is very much opposed to any kind of label. He doesn't want to hamstring himself or to put limitations on Christianity and Christian values. He doesn't want to pinpoint it to just one political party or one political ideology. And he's been very, very clear about that. Even when people try to say he's a prominent member of the religious left, he takes issue with that term, the religious left, because he thinks that it artificially divides Christian values onto a political spectrum. But Cornel West there on the right is much more comfortable with the term socialism, democratic socialism, and he identifies with that. He's written a lot about philosophy and political theory and theology in these terms, and of course racial issues involved in that. And both of these advocates are also interested in building coalitions, progressive coalitions for social justice, trying to overcome identity politics and the barriers of, coalition building, using Christian values to do that, using Christian values to reach out and find common cause with people who you might not agree with everything with them, not every issue, but you can still find common cause with them as, human beings trying to make a better world. Cornel West also very outspoken in his support of Bernie Sanders, Democratic Socialist candidate, which I think also puts him in sort of a spiritual socialist category. Bernie Sanders, not Bernie Sanders himself, but Cornel West, trying to infuse religious values into that movement. So that is the end of my talk. I will open it up to, I have no idea how much time we have left, but I will open it up to any questions you might have. I'm actually on time, good, I think.
Yeah, you're doing great, Vaneesa.
Okay, I just went on a long ramble, it feels like.
When you talk for about an hour, it can be difficult to determine those things. So, yeah, I'm happy to just to help moderate a little bit. People can jump in with questions. If you're more comfortable raising your hand, using that reaction feature or a thumbs up or even just physical hand raise, I'm happy to call on you as well. I might just ask Vaneesa, you mentioned something just to get things started and allow other people to gather their thoughts. You mentioned something in the introduction about spiritual socialists having oftentimes being accused of having a more vague or diffuse sense of what the kingdom of God would be like, or their actual vision for an instantiated political future. I'm curious if you could maybe kind of repeat what you said in the introduction, or even give us your own take on that. Was that a flaw? Do you see that as a bug or a feature to their program?
No, but that's a good question, because my advisors, such as Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen, my main advisor for this book, brought that up a number of times, saying, I don't really understand this concept of kingdom of God. You're not really defining it, defining your term, or what features these spiritual socialists were seeing in the kingdom of God. And she kept on, asking me to be more specific about what the kingdom of God meant for these spiritual socialists. And I said, okay, I'll try better. And I would go back to the sources and find that they were not specific whatsoever, other than to say that it was this future of, perfect cooperation and, you know, approaching what they thought heaven would be like, where everyone got along and there was peace and there wasn't suffering on earth, and there was perfect equality. And so they used all those sort of values as the features of this utopian vision. And I don't know if it was a flaw or, you know, they were accused of having this watered down theology about it, but I think it was them, and they did address it sometimes, and they said, well, we don't know what the future will be. We're trying to bring about a new world order, but we don't have perfect knowledge of what that's going to look like. We can only say that, you know, we want these values to be implemented, and we want these values to be part of, you know, the foundation of society. So I think they were vague either because they didn't want to become too doctrinaire, they didn't want to fall into strict doctrine, or because they themselves could only go so far in envisioning what the society would look like specifically. Adam?
So first, I want to thank you for a great talk. I mentioned in the chat that I'm teaching a class on history of radical and experimental education, and we discussed American socialists yesterday. But next week, A.J. Musty and Brookwood College, Sherwood Eddy, and the Southern Tenant Farmers Union are all going to be part of our reading. So it's just super duper, the talk you've given. I really enjoyed it so much. In a way, my question kind of builds on David's and the way you started us off, which is about terminology and labels and their advantages and disadvantages in building coalitions and solidarities, because all through we've seen the way in which either the label Christian or the label or spiritual or whatever or socialist could bring more people in and shut more people out, depending on how the coalition was seeking to build itself. And you started off by saying, you know, coming up with the term spiritual socialists was part of the process of doing this work and figuring out what would be a label capacious enough to include all the figures you have, but also have some traction to it so that it wasn't like a grab bag that everybody fit into. So I just wondered if you could meditate with us on the advantages and disadvantages of labels for your characters and also for you as the historian writing this work.
Yeah, that was also, sorry for the feedback. That was also a challenge, you know, not wanting to retrospectively put a label on, you know, that's sort of a sin of historians, to go back and retroactively say that someone identified a certain way that they didn't. But I try to come up with substantial evidence to say that, you know, they identified with some form of socialism, it just wasn't the traditional form, and so they could fit into this definition because they were all advocating for the same sort of social change and toward the same goals. I will say that, I don't know if this will answer your question whatsoever, because it is a complicated one, but in every figure that I talk about in the book, it was strange to me that, not strange, but just significant to me that they all said in a memoir or an essay or something, they all said, we feel like we're in between. We don't quite fit in anywhere, that we're too radical for Christians, and they dismiss us as being these radical, crazy political activists who are trying to shake things up. And then we feel too religious for the radicals, you know, that they think that we're suspicious because we're advocating these religious values. And so they all talked about feeling this overlapping identity or falling into a gap. I don't know, you know, how they would, if they saw it as a positive or negative, but they definitely felt this struggle to identify with either side of either the political spectrum or, you know, religious organizations. And so that their attempt to reconcile this in their personal life, you know, had these ramifications in their associations with other people, that they all had trouble sort of defining who they were. But thank you, Adam. A good question. Yep. Maya?
Hi, thank you so much. That was a wonderful and interesting talk. And so my question is, you mentioned how the spiritual socialists tended to gravitate towards focusing on more different groups in society and levels of oppression than simply class. And so I'm wondering, did they ever collaborate or exchange ideas with different indigenous groups or tribes?
I'm sure they did. I think Henry Wallace comes to mind only because I know Henry Wallace was very interested in Native American religion, that and he liked the mystical aspects of that. He read extensively about Native American religions. I don't know that he was an interlocutor with anyone specifically from a tribe, but no, that's a good question. No, I don't really know the answer to that. They certainly wouldn't have excluded or dismissed Native Americans, but I don't have a good answer for you in terms of, oh yes, they gave this speech at, this society, or, wherever. Matthew?
Yeah, thanks so much for the great talk. It's really, really interesting, and it's all fairly new to me, but I'm really intrigued by Wallace, to kind of piggyback off of that last statement. All of what you said about him was really interesting to me, but you said that the New Deal was temporary in his eyes. And I'm thinking about the way that you sort of styled or like described the sort of Christian eschatological visions. Like I'm thinking back to like earlier times when sort of the millenarianisms, like the optimism that like Jesus would come back like imminently and sort of set up the kingdom on earth, or maybe lift believers out of the world, like as a sort of escapist vision. So this seems to be more of a grounded, like kingdom of God on earth vision that you're describing. And there's an optimism for what's possible through like bureaucracy, government, and so forth. At the same time, I'm wondering, like you're describing that all of these folks, it seems, are going through a personal existential crisis, trying to like fit this within their world. And I'm wondering, what were their biggest worries? Like Wallace, if the New Deal was temporary, for example, was that because it would be making way for the fullness of the kingdom of God to come? Or was it that he saw something else? And I guess, what were their worries about aligning with government to bring about social reform?
Very good question. Wallace is definitely struggling with this because he's part of this administration. He believes in helping people with the New Deal. He believes in, but he always says, it's the spirit of the New Deal. It's, the spirit of the New Deal is going to take over. And at some point, we're just going to have to start implementing this in just our daily lives at the community level. So kind of like with Marx was saying, okay, government intervention will be this temporary step toward a more utopian vision. I think Wallace, I don't think it's intentional that he's following in Marx's path there, but I think he's thinking of the New Deal and state management in the same way. But to your point further, Dorothy Day, very interesting in these terms, because Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin, her co-founder of Catholic Worker, were incredibly anti-statist, incredibly anti-government or any kind of top-down, even the New Deal. They were critical of the New Deal and the social democracy that was being implemented in that administration. Because, and this gets to your point, they said it's sort of a cop-out for people actually being responsible for their neighbors and for actually taking a very intimate step toward, helping people in your community. They would say, if you pay taxes and then you just rely on the government to solve all the problems, then that's an intermediary from your actual spiritual responsibility toward people. And she thought that it was a very they thought it was a very, clinical response or approach to the problems, a very non-spiritual response to the problems. So they did think that it should go through the churches, it should go through community organizations like Catholic Worker, and be very decentralized. So she and Peter Maurin absolutely talked about decentralization of socialist outreach and socialist programs. And even the New Deal, which she didn't vote because she thought, I'm not going to get involved in political parties that don't have anything to do with the spiritual needs of people on the ground. So so anyway, she's the best example, and I do have more details on that in the book with quotations from her about why she's so anti-state.
Paul Nittar's had his hand raised here. I just want to make sure to get him in.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed you.
Thank you, and I share the gratitude, Ms. Cook, for your presentation, and also for the opportunity to read your introduction. I have a question for you that I'm going to try to answer myself. You tell me if it's the right answer. And a very kind of a basic question, namely, how would you describe the difference between a kind of standard socialist and a spiritual socialist? Where's the difference? And my answer, which I'm going to ask you if you think it's right, is that a spiritual socialist realizes or thinks that to realize the goals of socialism, we need spiritual resources. We can't do it kind of just as a purely human or purely secular project. Then I say, if that's more or less correct, what kind of resources are they looking for? Is it, from your introduction, kind of resources that will help them define their values? Or is it because they were looking for resources that will that will transform themselves? In other words, give them resources themselves that will give them, provide the stamina to carry on the struggle. They're looking for an internal transformation in order to affect a social transformation. Anyway, comments are welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, so a lot of differences between traditional socialism and spiritual socialism. Some of those I went over earlier, but good point about resources. I've never actually thought of it in terms of resources, but definitely behavioral changes. That's what they were looking for. And you kind of talked about that with make the change within yourself, make the change on the local level in your daily activities, infuse everything you do with your values. And if it doesn't align with your values, then you shouldn't be doing it. And so I would say they were looking at the social side of socialism, where it was more behavior and how people treat each other, and try to make that very basic change. And many of them, or most of them, all of them, would say that unless that happened, you're never going to change society significantly or fundamentally. And now there's the question of human nature and whether that could ever happen. They address that here and there. Can humans really change in that way? Can society change? Do we just keep, circling over the same ground in terms of problems and new problems? But their hope was that, I think that they thought if we can't hope for a different society, then it will never occur. So you may as well just hope in it and work towards it, because what else is worth living for, even if it never does happen.
Thank you.
Can I kind of have a follow-up question?
Sure.
So last time we had a talk on the political evensong in Germany. So it's a situation where following the student movement and the radicalization of it, theologians used traditional Christian liturgy and filled it with very political ideas, and created, if you will, a political liturgy, which is still identifiable as very traditional Christian. And I know that Walter Rauschenbusch once wrote, I think, I don't remember if he called it a socialist Lord's Prayer, but at least he really kind of used a traditional genre, but reframed it or reworded it. So it's enormously powerful, and it's kind of a different language, a different genre. I'm curious if you came across in your research at more of this type of material. Are there any spiritual socialist liturgies, or is it only a matter of discourse? It sounded like they all want to create different type of person, behavioral changes. So is it a matter of discourse, or did they create something else? Did they create a different language? Did they create worship services? So kind of, what did they do beyond talking about it?
Yep. So I'll go back to Salone's quote from his book Bread and Wine, where he said it's really a solidarity of the poor, or, you know, and you see this in Latin American Christian socialists too. Solidarity of the poor, solidarity of the oppressed, people coming together in unions, whether, you know, not just unions in the trade union sense, but unions and communities. None of these people would be opposed to prayer, and I'm sure that happened at organizational meetings, strikes, marches, things like that. I'm sure prayer was part of their activism, but they didn't talk about, oh, we need to, you know, have a prayer, you know, we need this this prayer, or, you know, that needs to be something prominent. I would say that the substitute for that, I don't know if substitute's the right word, but the equivalent to that would be protest songs, particularly in the civil rights movement, adopting old gospel songs for new purposes, all throughout the New Left movement, protest songs. Getting together and singing was kind of a practice in that way that you're talking about, Ulrich, I think, where it was their form of praying. And it was sort of infusing these spiritual values into these political protest songs. And that goes back to Highlander folk school. That was a prominent practice there through all the marches of the civil rights and New Left movement. Even today, I think people still rely on the old songs and don't come up with new ones, or they just put new words to old tunes. But I think that's something that people still turn to as sort of a spiritual expression with political content. I don't know if that answers, but that's just the best equivalent I can come up with, where that creates a sense of unity among people, you know, trying to come together for that purpose. Any other questions from anyone, or?
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
I have a question that I'm still grappling with, and I welcome any comments, but why do you think that progressive religious activity or discourse, you know, isn't as well known as the more conservative variety, the moral majority, that sort of?
Brandon, I saw his hand.
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to use this. Thanks so much for this really interesting talk. I mean, just one thing that comes to mind is you mentioned that Dorothy Day's, I think, sort of conception of this idea of utopian socialism came from Martin Buber, which I thought was quite interesting. I don't know if that's just kind of, you know, was there a sort of serious engagement with Buber? I mean, with other sort of Jewish thinkers? I know you briefly mentioned that, and then maybe just thinking about how you would unpack the utopian socialism, right? So you know, you've talked a lot about the kind of socialism part, but maybe less about the utopian part. And of course, one kind of connotation of that word is that this vision is not, you know, really realizable in the kind of human realm. And I think that we can think of Buber in some sense as a, you know, sort of a political romantic and a utopian who didn't necessarily have a kind of, you know, sort of very strong grip on some of the political realities of his time, maybe. So I'm just curious if you could sort of unpack that, both the relationship to Buber, but then sort of the utopian dimension and kind of what that might mean.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can do it justice. I know that she did read his works extensively, so she definitely did have, yeah, she was engaged with his writings and his theories. The utopian part I know can just refer to, you know, this vision of the perfect society, but also a place that can never be. And, you know, I kind of mentioned that where even Sherwood Eddy, he said, you know, maybe he always thought, you know, maybe we won't ever get there, but why not keep trying? You know, we have to believe in something. And if we don't believe in it, we never will have a chance. And so there was that doubt in people's minds, you know, to a certain extent that, you know, this could ever be realized, but they wanted to try and approximate it as much as they could and to make contributions as much as they could. Many of them, like Dorothy Day, just thought it was living as a Christian. This is, if you're a Christian, this is what you do. And you don't worry about the outcome. You don't worry about if you're making a change or not. She's like, that's for God to decide, or that's for future generations to decide. I'm just trying to live my values in the here and now and do what I can in those terms. I don't, I think it is a shame that I couldn't find more exemplars from the Jewish tradition to put in the book in these terms, because as many of you know, Jewish radicals tended to be, they didn't write in explicitly religious language very often or associate in that way. Will Herberg, I think, maybe could have been mentioned more in my book. So if you know Will Herberg's writings, that he might be an example of that. Herschel, of course, which Rosenhagen mentioned earlier. But yeah, that was a difficulty that I faced in trying to find, I didn't want to assign these Jewish activists that label and be wrong about them, because I'm not a historian of Jewish ideas. But I did talk to historians like Tony Michaels, who said, yeah, you're right, there really aren't a lot of people who could fit into that category who were involved in political activism at that time.
Karl, did you still have a question or comment? You're muted right now.
Yes, thanks for the paper. There is now, I think, a significant literature about the emergence of the Christian right, which has kind of taken the mantle of Christianity, and part of it is post-World War II, sort of the spiritual side of the military-industrial complex, quite explicitly. But it also goes back to the fundamentalist modernist controversies in Protestantism. It's interesting, you mentioned Eddy went to Princeton, and Princeton was sort of ground zero in the 1920s for the fundamentalist modernist conflict. And in fact, the seminary split, with the conservative group going to form Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. But it was the Princetonians of the 19th century who really formulated a doctrine of biblical literalism, which becomes the foundation of, at least on the evangelical side, the Christian New Right. That goes into, that kind of goes into hiding after the Scopes trial, but it emerges in force after the Second World War. Again, as I say, is kind of the spiritual arm of the military-industrial complex. And there is a literature on that. I would also maybe pose a question which we don't have time to talk about, but you spoke about government and you spoke about the individual. But for Christians, there's also the church. And of course, I think for Christians, before the Second Vatican Council in America, the church is a mess. What is it? But it's a question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll start out with Dorothy Day there, because she was a devout Catholic, went to church regularly, and believed in Catholicism, but yet still criticized the church, and particularly the New York City institution in the archdiocese there. She would write letters to the archdiocese and the cardinals of the Catholic Church in New York City, criticizing them for not speaking out on issues of social justice, for not speaking against war, for not sticking up for strikes and labor problems. She did not shy away from that. And in her correspondence, there are several letters that you can read to Father Cardinal, I'm forgetting his name. It's been so many years since I wrote this book.
Spellman?
No. Wait. No. Anyway. And so even though she was believed in this church, she also saw problems with the hierarchy of it, with the male-dominated sort of culture of it. So she did have issues with the way it was structured and its lack of comment on a lot of social justice issues. So I don't really know how to explain that, and she didn't adequately reconcile it, at least in her diary and her letter. She didn't address it explicitly enough for me to speak about how she reconciled that in her own faith. But that's a very good question, because even though many of these activists were involved in church throughout their life, whether it be a Quaker meeting or whether, you know, they came up with their own sort of labor temple, or they all had to grapple with these institutions versus values.
With that, we're pushing on past 5:30 here. So thank you all for coming. Thank you especially to Vaneesa for the presentation and for a good Q&A here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everyone's attention here and their engagement with this.
Give you one. Just to add a concluding announcement or two, if you want to be on our email list, you can drop me a private message here in the short term, or shoot me an email at the email I just put in. Our next conversation, our next seminar will be on December 2nd, so almost a month and a half away here. Killian will be presenting, as I mentioned earlier. I have the full title here now, didn't have it before. Shifting Frontiers, Pilgrims, Protestants, and Revolutionaries in 18th Century Europe. So perhaps kind of continuing a political arc as we've had the last 2 months here. I think that's all I have here today. Vaneesa, if you have any other comments, or if anyone has anything to stick around and talk about, feel free. Otherwise, take care.
No, thank you very much. And if you know someone who, you know, has another need for content or presentation or book talk, just let me know, and I'd be happy to share this presentation again anywhere.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.